That's hindsight 101, huh?
Over again.
Huh?
Jeff Carr. I guess he's coming up. He looks a little lost. I bet he doesn't know he has a seat up here. They'll all figure it out. Absolutely. And you know, most nights it gets cooler, but sometimes if you're sitting here, it's a little bit dark. And then it gets so cold that it's not ideal. This ceiling is not ideal. Yeah, it's nice to see some rocks. It is nice to see some rocks. Probably Steve will open it up. It doesn't have to be, but it's an opportunity to let townspeople out to really address.
I'm anticipating all positive.
I think it'll be about your baggy shirt, and I really hope.
Can we not talk about my baggy shirt? I'm 4 weeks away from my shirt's to be finished, and then I'm done. But
He's lost so much weight.
I lost 30 pounds.
So I told him he had two choices. Either buy a new wardrobe or gain 30 pounds.
You wouldn't know it from seeing the pants I've been wearing recently. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. So, it was brought on.
Oh my gosh, Dan, it was not. But your perception.
It was. And traditionally, the men in my family, they as much weight as they put on, it all goes right here and nowhere else. So like skinny legs, thin arms, and everything.
Believe me, I have it.
No. Just like little bad. It depends on the program. It's either 2:30 or 30 to 10 seats here. Yeah. It's a 10-minute straight. But yeah, the flip side of that is, I mean, I have clothes that are like 20 years old. Yeah.
Tell Sarah we miss her.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
It's a bum thing.
I lost the dogs.
Which dog? I think.
How are you? I nearly crashed into you the other day.
He just got that from Ken and Denise. Yeah.
I was waving at you and I'm in a different car.
Oh,
It was like,
am I singing hysterically?
I thought you were talking to me.
I just heard, I don't know. It was random. There you go. We like gas station. Oh, thank you. That's close.
Yeah.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
Crawling along. What? Yes, I am.
I wanted you,
Anybody can come along. Yeah. I'm just going to briefly.
I ran out of ink, black ink on my printer, so I improvised. I'm printing everything in red.
That's good. The only shredding. I'm going to briefly just kind of talk about the overall philosophy and because they feel a lot impactful. I'll turn it over to you, and I'll just try and tell people that we want to try to limit speech for didactic kind of discussion. Ron's not here. He's certainly not here now. He wasn't going to come. Oh, I'm sorry. He didn't tell you? He didn't know.
I remember we hired it's budget season, and it's a lousy
Oh, I did? I'm surprised. I'm only surprised because I never drink coffee.
Well, you said we would get together.
Oh, okay. Oh, I
It
see.
wasn't coffee.
I see. Well, I'll stick to my green tea.
Okay, you do green tea. I will do the double espresso.
Let's see how bad the state of the
So I'm trying
I wish there was a decent place.
I think we need those guys here to start.
I think so,
They're not-
since it's 7:30.
So I did this so that I
Do they know we're here?
So where are they?
Randy, we told them it was at the middle school, not town hall, right?
Oh, no, this for the library. That one.
Just checking.
Well, you have all the
Got here from the
people, you sent them really.
Sent the three of them that, he wrote the address too.
Let's hope my notes. You know what?
Not here yet.
We'll measure this line. So it's
In your rep.
the only person I think who might not know is the door open.
They might open
I
the
think
parking
so.
Northwest Middle School, I learned.
I know a lot of people.
Well, if
There's somebody out front of the building, part of the building.
give them a thing, it's fine, but if they're not open,
It's just Gina.
that might be worth checking. Is there someone out front in the front entrance of the library to make sure that if our reps go to the front entrance of the building, so that if our reps go to the front entrance of the building, they're directed out of the building? No, but there's signs to the library. There's signs to the library. We should be able to do that. It's the back, and the parking in the back that might be the issue.
Some of your work has been very good looking. I was gonna tell you, twin brother.
I have my phone here in case we get a text message. You might get a text message, somebody might get a text message.
Yeah, I got no text yet.
I got an email from the.
Somebody's sick. It's Chica. And
Oh.
So she's joking with him. I think she's like, the book was, okay. Are we going through this or like?
I assume politicals will have some speeches.
Kind of need the guests of honor.
Yeah.
If we could talk amongst ourselves.
We could vote whether in favor.
I don't think we can vote because it's not on the agenda.
We can always add it.
It's a special meeting.
So does someone get a surprise as the first
Dick will
rep
like
who
that.
arrives
He's a
gets
stickler for
special
details.
award for-
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Evening. How are you, Jeff? Good. How you doing? Yeah, nice driving.
We gave you the address.
And you have such a good turnout. Who's Mike's on? Probably.
I wish just flip the signs around and cut it to the blue one.
Tony wants to call. Hold on.
See?
Hey, Tony. No problem. Everyone apparently is, so we're going to.
You're missing all three, right? Is this something?
What?
Is this something we do regularly, or is this?
Every 2 years.
Thanks, how are you?
2 years ago, the state was threatening us too. And so we had a really good session. This time we got more publicity. I'm surprised there aren't even more people here.
You know what I read about today for the first time?
Will's here, sure.
Will's here?
The city park.
Ah, we got one of them.
Maybe July.
What's the problem now?
We got 1 out of 3. Tony Wong's in here in 10 minutes, he says.
Pictures you have are like crazy selfies of our children. And so I think we're gonna do it.
Yeah, are you going to be a walker?
Like last year, all my friends rented it.
How you doing?
Yeah.
Hi.
I know, I wish I wore
Ellen is my favorite. I love you.
Who all knows their smokers and trying to, you know, if there's any.
It is, and they want to squeeze more out of us. More. That's the point. More.
You know, sure, you know what I.
Yeah. Time to go. Niece and nephew.
No, when it's when we're ready.
I'm sorry. Didn't say it right. No. They were there at the same time.
Tony just called, it's about 10 minutes.
Okay.
So you want to start with just Will?
No. But I think we should tell people what we're going to do. Just organizationally.
Hello. So Senator Haskell is here. I just got a call from Senator Wong, who's going to be here in, I guess, about 9 minutes as of now. And we're still waiting on Rep. Hughes. What we're going to
try and do with the format tonight is I'm going to have a brief opening statement that I'll make as soon as we get a quorum of representatives at least. And I'll go through some, we actually sent to each of the reps, to the two senators and the rep, several bills that we thought would be in one way or another very impactful to the town that have been floating through the legislature in one form or another. And I'm going to briefly go through why I believe those bills will be impactful, and then I'll open it up to my colleagues on the other boards. Hopefully we can have a very educational discussion where my hope is that we educate our representatives about the specific impacts that we believe these bills will have on us, and they will educate us on their specific positions vis-a-vis these bills in terms of how they intend to represent us on this. So that said, I think we're going to have at least another 5 minutes before Senator Wong gets here, and then we'll probably get moving. So, Steve Ezzy has a statement.
No, I don't have a statement, but there are a lot of faces here tonight that we generally don't see in our various meetings between the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, and the Board of Education. So it might be helpful if every one of us introduce ourselves, so we're something other than a group of people sitting at a big table. Maybe I'll start with my board, since I'm looking at them, and we can just kind of go around and just introduce yourself. So face to a name.
Hello, folks. I'm Greg Murphy, and I'm on the Board of Finance.
Jeff Farr, also on the Board of Finance, new member.
Dick Bochinsky.
Or Mike, make sure the light's green and bring it close to you.
Jeff Farr, also on the Board of Finance, new member.
Dick Bochinsky, Board of Finance.
Stefan Grosinger, Board of Selectmen.
Samantha Nestor, Board of Selectmen.
And I'm Steve Ezzy. I'm the current chairman of the Board of Finance.
Chris Balding, First Selectman.
Gina Albert, Chair of Board of Education.
Ellen Usdenoff, Board of Education.
Tony Pesco, Board of Education.
Dan McNeil, Board of Education.
Ruby Hedge, Board of Education.
Melissa Walker, Board of Education.
So just, if I could sing, I'd do that, but I can't. So let me just fill in a little bit of time. So we're right in the middle of the budget. We're right.
Oh,
yeah. Now you don't want me to sing. So we're right in the middle of the budget season. Both the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education have presented their budgets to the Board of Finance last week. We're going to do some deliberations on those in a couple of weeks. I think that's the date, the 26th. But one thing I would like to encourage everyone to do is come to the town meeting when the town gets to vote on their approval or not of the respective budgets. So it's the one time when you really can stand up and make your voice heard. And for the past few years, I think it's been 3. We've not had a quorum, so the budget just gets accepted as presented. And certainly, it would be great if we could get a quorum and we could get a discussion going, so we all have an input into, how our town finances are managed. This is a challenging period, to say the least, financially for Weston. It's also challenging, obviously, for the state and also for Fairfield County. So, with that, Ann is here, Tony's here. Oh, excuse me, Will's here. We're just waiting for Tony. What would you like to do?
We know Tony called me a few minutes ago. He is on the way, so he gave me 10 minutes. Probably closer to 5 now. So, out of courtesy, I think I'll give it another 5 minutes and then we'll get started. As Steve said, Representative Hughes just came in about Will Haskell. Here's the mic. Okay. And again, you know, the format will be, I'll have an opening statement. I'm going to turn it over to the board members to ask their questions. There'll be hopefully a healthy back and forth with our representatives, and then time permitting, and we have some representatives who are willing to stick around. We will have the public speak. I would like to limit that to 3 minutes each, and not have people speak again until everybody's been given a chance to speak, because there's a large group of people. You know, actually, can I just get a hand raised to find out if we need to send a sign-up sheet out to see if people want to speak, or if there aren't that many? Yeah, if you can just raise your hand if you think you're going to speak. Okay, it doesn't look like a lot of people want to speak, so that's good. So we could probably just have people come up to the microphone in a polite fashion. You're not committed to speak or not. I was trying to get a general idea so we knew how to structure it. So, I believe so. That will be held 8 o'clock, and that will be at the high school auditorium. Thank you. You're welcome.
The living calendar. I love it.
And for those of you who aren't familiar, small New England town government, particularly Weston, we have what's called an ATBM, which stands for All Town Budget Meeting. That's where we get together. If we have a quorum, the meeting is convened and we're able to discuss the budget, which means you could theoretically modify the budget at that time, and we will vote on the Board of Ed budget, the town operating budget, and then each of the capital items individually. As Chairman Ezzies has mentioned, we have failed to get a quorum, which is 150-ish people. 130 people to actually show up. Some of that is strategic gamesmanship. I understand the strategy behind it, but you know, I'm a firm believer in small town democracy, and it would be nice to have the town fully participate. That said, if there is not a quorum at that meeting, the meeting doesn't commence. It's adjourned. Then we have a referendum, which is a machine vote on the budgets as they are, yes or no, up, down. That will commence that evening and will recommence on Saturday, I forget what May 4th. Thank you, Margaret, the calendar. So if anybody's got a stand-up routine, now would be the time to pull it out of the hat. I would begin, except that I did get a call from Senator Wong, who did say he was almost here. So I assume he's having trouble parking, because we have a fairly impressive audience here tonight, and parking is limited. Go right ahead. Yeah, Tony's fine. Yeah. And he has bills. The official count is a lot.
Hey, Jeff, why don't you guys move down here? Yeah. Get rid of these things.
Take the mics, please. And for reference, this meeting is being recorded. Richard, when do we think we'll get this up? Tomorrow? Tomorrow this will be available on the town website. There's also, it's on Vimeo. Incidentally, all the Board of Selectmen meetings are available online, so if you can't come, and I know a lot of people are sad they miss our meetings, please feel free to reference them there. So we're going to go ahead and get started, I guess, because Senator Wong's here. Thank you, Senator Wong. Okay, so now we have our two state senators, Senator Wong, Senator Haskell, and our representative, Ann Hughes, here. This is a meeting that the three boards decide to convene to have a discussion, so we can have sort of a back and forth educational session where you educate us about your positions, we educate you about sort of the specific impacts that we believe a set of bills will have that are now making their way through the legislature on the town. I'm hoping that we will do more dialogue and information than speechifying, but again, I can't control it, and everybody's got a right to do what they want. I'm going to try and keep my remarks as limited as possible and open it up to the rest of the boards and to the townsfolk. So there's been a lot of information out there, some good, some bad, and frankly, a lot of misinformation, and a lot of that came, frankly, because some of the bills were put out, we find out now, to not necessarily get enacted, but just for the sake of starting conversation. Not ideal policy, but that's where we are. So I'm hoping that this meeting will hopefully clarify some of those issues, make it clear what these bills are and are not, the ones that actually have a realistic chance of going through, and I'll throw in some information that I gleaned from having a conversation with the governor a couple of weeks ago when he came down here, and hopefully we can get some resolution on all this and everybody walks away at least comfortable understanding the process. So the bills in question, I'm going to go through one at a time very briefly. The first one is what's called SB 73, Act Concerning the Creation of Regional School Districts. That's also known as the Looney Bill. That had to do with regionalizing schools that had fewer than 40,000 students. My understanding is that's basically dead. Nobody's talking about that. Looney himself says that the intention of that was to start a conversation, and my understanding is it's not going anywhere, but I'll let our representatives clarify that. I'm just putting that out. SB 457, which was basically put forward by Duff, is an act concerning the size of school districts. This is a similar bill, but this one was talking about school districts with less than 2,000 students would be compelled to regionalize. That one, my understanding, is also no longer sort of flowing through the system. The one that sort of is flowing through the system that has to do with regionalization is SB 874, which is the implementer for the governor's budget. And that one has some misinformation in it, and we've clarified with the governor's office some of the information. That's the one that establishes a commission on school shared services, but also it requires a consolidation when there's a population of less than 10,000. Again, Weston doesn't get hit by that. 2,000 students, we don't get hit by that. But then there's a line in there that wasn't exactly clear that said, or has only one or two elementary schools. That was an issue that was of particular concern to Wilton and Weston, because if you look at the map of the districts that would be hit by this, kind of Wilton and Weston were sitting there out in the middle of nowhere, and there are no other schools that are impacted by this except Weston and Wilton. So First Selectman Vanderslice of Wilton and I basically did some research. She eventually got hold of some of the governor's representatives. They made it clear that that's what they considered a drafting error. Unfortunately, it was a drafting error that caused a whole lot of concern, but our understanding is once that error is fixed, we will no longer fall into that category. However, the establishment of this Commission on Shared School Services is still there. There's a lot of concern about that, about what they're going to eventually recommend. My position on that would be that at minimum, if there's any commission, it should, and I had a discussion with Dr. Wurtenberg about this, that the must should be changed to mays and the shall should be changed to shoulds so that it's not going to compel anything. So it's recommendations. I think it's reasonable to have discussions, but not force and compel things. It has also some good things in there, and this is out of the governor's bill saying that any school building committee should have at least one member who has experience in construction, things like that. Not a bad thing, but just trying to give you clarity. By the way, this summary that I'm sort of reading off of is available somewhere. There's a pile of them. We made a bunch of them. The next bill is a big one that has a lot of impact to us, which is HB 7150, which is called an Act Concerning Education. And the big part of this is what's called the teacher pension shift. That's where currently teachers contribute a share of their salary, I believe it's 18% or something, to their pensions, but then most of the costs are borne by the state, and these are sort of a ballooning pool. The legacy costs and what are called normal costs, which are forward-looking liabilities, are expected to balloon and really are what people are talking about when they're talking about sort of the Connecticut fiscal mess in terms of pension problems. The bill would actually anticipate shifting 25% of normal teacher pension costs to the towns, and we have the numbers on those. In addition, and normal again is forward, not the legacy costs. In addition, it would have a 1% incremental additional cost to towns that are above the state median. Weston is 24% above the state median. So basically, if this bill were to go into effect as it stands, Weston would be paying 49% of the teachers' annual expected pension costs with no say on how that was originally negotiated, et cetera. You could see why that would be of concern. This year, the liability looks like about 260-something thousand. Next year, it goes to like 580, and the next year, it's 870,000. Those are costs that we haven't had in the past. That's going to be incremental. That's going to go on a taxpayer. From my perspective, it's a little bit problematic in that we are taking stuff that was normally handled from income tax and now shifting it to real estate tax, but that's a philosophical issue I have. It also does some modifications on the ECS formula that generally have not been very productive for Weston. And I'm sure we're going to hear our representative's opinion on that bill. The next one is HB 7319, which is one that just popped up kind of nowhere and is raising a great deal of concern. And this one's talking about sort of regionalizing school districts into taxing districts. That is basically, right now, Weston's got the Georgetown Fire District, which basically has its own taxing authority. It doesn't go through the town, and they issue taxes, and it's an independent sort of structure. This act would actually set up these multi-town school pools, basically, that would have their own taxing authority, where they would be able to issue tax bills, and the Board of Finance wouldn't be in any way involved in sort of discussions. They'd be sort of separate, floating, independent entities. I don't know what the seriousness of that bill was. I don't know where it came out. I'd love to hear some further clarification about thoughts about whether that has any legs. My understanding was it didn't have much, but I don't want to speak for our representatives. The big one, and it hasn't been talked about a lot, and it's been very much overshadowed by the regionalization talks and concerns, and rightfully so in some senses, but it's much more of an economic problem for us, is what's called SB 431, because that effectively would get rid of our car taxes, which kind of sounds good at first, but we get $3.4 million through car and property taxes coming into our town. That would be replaced by a statewide mill rate on real property with an adjustment for homestead exemption. In addition, after taking in that $3.4 million, it now factors into our revenue and our budget. It would redistribute the revenue statewide to fund pilot reimbursements. Pilot is payment in lieu of taxes. That goes for hospitals, universities, utilities. We have a very small proportion of our tax base that would fall under that, and it's mainly Eversource polls and stuff like that. So it also says it would go to increase special education grants and education funding for the Alliance School District, but it would be based on this needs formula that I'm not even clear on. As you know, Weston is a fairly wealthy town. Well, not everybody's wealthy, obviously, and a lot of people get more impacted than others, but relative to other towns in the state, that means I'm not all that optimistic that any of that money would come back. So we'd have a $3.4 million hole potentially in our budget, and if anybody's been following our budget, it makes any of our annual increases look fairly trivial, and I honestly don't know where we'd make up that difference. I'll end on the final bill I asked our representatives to look at, which is SB 882, and that's actually a great thing from my perspective. It's called an Act Concerning Municipal Arbitration and Municipal Employee Retirement Systems. This came out of the governor's bill, and I'm asking you all to strongly support this. right now, the pension system, which is called MERS, which is Municipal Employee Retirement System, it's a great system, but again, it's not rationally funded at this point. Employees contribute 2.5%. Past assumptions were about 8% returns. This year, they changed that to a 7% return. That change in that 1% expected return is going to cost Weston about $1 million in the next 5 years. That's $1 million over anything we had talked about in the past. That just showed up like 3 days before we closed out our budget. That's probably going to have to come down again. 7%, annual return is still pretty high. That's going to be another $1 million to come to us. What the bill says is that the employee contribution is going to increment up over time to 9 to 11% over years. And then the employees will have a greater share of participation into the plan, which will make the town or the employer, we're the town, their contribution somewhat less and should blunt some of the impact. The other thing it does is I don't want to get into minutia of arbitration, but the way it stands now, it disincentivizes sort of neutral arbiters for various reasons. And this bill would basically mandate neutral arbitration or neutral membership on the arbitration panels, which will help sort of theoretically the results of that arbitration be a little more balanced and maybe have a little more teeth. So that said, those are the bills. I've sort of briefly explained why most of them are going to be pretty bad for Weston. One of them would be pretty good, and we'd ask you to support. The other ones we'd ask to push back on. There's been some characterization of your opinions along the way. I think this is a perfect opportunity for you all to clarify your exact positions on this and to clarify any misconceptions I have about the state of reality of some of these bills, whether they are alive or they're not, whether the forks have been put in them or not. That said, I'll turn it over to Steve Ezzies briefly, and then we can move along.
Thanks, Tony, Will, and Ann, for coming here this evening. I would assume that most people are here, tell me if I'm wrong, to talk about the three education bills. Is that right? I mean, I would think this room is full of people that are concerned about this proposed regionalization. So I would like to have that addressed first. But before I make that comment, because this will be recurring and when I have the opportunity to talk, there's a bifurcation that's going on in Hartford right now. And the bifurcation is that the leadership, which is a term I have a difficult time talking about, is basically from the larger cities. And the proposals that are coming out would have a very negative impact on this community and other towns in Fairfield County. And that includes not only the bills that we're talking about here, but Ann, your Progressive Caucus doesn't help it at all either. And so we need to address the understanding of what are the needs of Weston, and it's Weston that has elected you to your positions, and what are the needs away from Weston. Because as far as I'm concerned, I'm most concerned about the town that I live in. And the regionalization bills, which I describe as Looney, Duff, and Lamont, as opposed to giving them numbers, all three, in my estimation, should be defeated. They're ill-conceived. They haven't been really thought out. They've been kind of thrown up against the wall, and let's see what comes out of it. And despite the fact that the governor's bill looks like it doesn't impact Weston, at the end of the day, you really don't know. And so maybe we can just start with those three bills and just, give us your opinion on where you are on Looney, Duff, and Lamont.
Sure. Thanks all for showing up and, can you hear me? Showing up and staying engaged. I don't hear this. But
about 5 or 6 inches.
okay.
There you go.
The first two bills, like you said, there's been such good, strong, unified opposition, including my own testimony to the Education Committee. I don't think it's going anywhere. We don't serve on that committee, so we don't get a vote on it yet. only if it comes out and we can see some, improvements, but we don't want any improvements on those first two bills. The governor's bill, we want, at least I feel like we want to be at the table to talk about and to be in the room with because he's admitted this is a concept bill, even though it's 32 pages, and there might be some things that we could, agree with him on. I liked Harry's suggestion that he put forth to conduct an independent audit instead of establishing a commission on shared school services, and really look at what are some of the viable savings that truly hold education harmless, which is what he's proposing to do. And we have all kinds of reasons why this bill does not hold education harmless in his budget. But the reality is he gets to propose a balanced budget that deals with the $1.5 billion deficit that we are facing, with another $500 million for the second year. We have to pass a balanced budget that deals with that directly. So part of that process is taking, suggestions and solutions, especially with citizen input, which is why I'm so happy that you're here today. Say, this is not acceptable. What is acceptable? What are we willing to invest in to make sure that we hold education harmless? So I've asked for a meeting with the governor. I've told him that we are meeting tonight, and that I'm going to hear, hopefully, a lot of input about what are some viable solutions that we can live with that don't look like these problematic things for all the reasons that, Chris, you talked about. So we'll start there.
Excuse me, we're not hearing very much from what
Really?
you're saying. Your microphone doesn't work at all.
Hello.
Hello. Oh.
Yeah, yours is working great.
Yeah. Will, do you want to?
Check, check.
There we go.
There
Okay.
it goes.
There's something wrong with this.
Close.
Okay.
Well, do you want to,
No,
or you're
go
all set? Thank you all for convening this meeting. I'm really grateful. In some of the other towns, we meet with the Board of Ed and the Board of Finance and the Board of Selectmen separately. So at the very least, no matter what happens tonight, this is incredibly efficient. And I'm grateful not only for all of you being here, but also members of the public. It's been sort of baptism. Senator Wong's been there for some time, but for Representative Hughes and I, it's been baptism by fire a little bit when it comes to school regionalization. I represent a district with about 100,000 people and have heard from now around 2,000 constituents about this issue. It's clearly such a cause of concern, and for good reason, because obviously schools are what make this community and the others that I represent so appealing to live in. It's why my mom chose to move to Westport. It's why so many people who I met while door knocking, or I've met in the months since, have told me that they chose Weston. So it's obviously a cause of concern for me as well. That's why as soon as Senator Looney's bill was put forward, I think it was 4 hours later, I joined with a few other Democratic senators and also representatives in issuing a statement against it. And that's because at the end of the day, I do believe that I was elected to represent Weston and Westport and Wilton, and not one particular political party. The bosses that I answer to, and whether it's tonight or a few years from now, are the voters and the municipal leaders. So I don't feel the need to fall in line with my party, and I think I've already demonstrated that by speaking out against Senator Looney's bill. Senator Duff's bill is certainly not perfect either, and I've been sort of working with him to try to advocate to bring that number down, because the intention of his legislation is that there are 83 school districts in Connecticut with fewer than 2,000 students. Most of those, all of those 83, have their own superintendent. There's a greater number, or there's a large portion of those 83 have around 1,000 students or 800 students and operate inefficiently, whereas there are districts like Weston with, I believe it's 2,300 at the moment, that operate incredibly efficiently. So if we can bring that number down to start to talk about what I think the governor's bill really addresses head on, which is the fact that there is inefficiency in our education system, not in towns like ours where student outcomes are exceptional. We have high quality teachers. We have the right ratio of back office administrators to the number of residents, the number of taxpayers. But we should talk about the towns that don't operate so efficiently. And those include towns like Sterling in eastern Connecticut, which has around 300 students, and they get $3 million in education cost-sharing grants from the state every single year. Weston gets $263,000 from the state, or at least it did last year, and it has, like I said, around 2,300 students. So look, I don't think it's the role of the state government to tell a town like Sterling or another small town that they can't hire their own superintendent, their own special ed coordinator, their own back office administration. That's their freedom to do so, and if they want to continue that way, in my mind, God bless them. But, and I don't think that the state senate or the House of Representatives should get involved. But should the town of Sterling be able to send the bill to Hartford to subsidize that inefficiency? I'm not sure, because when I think about my constituents and who I represent, when you send a bill to Hartford, what you're really doing is sending it to Fairfield County. 1 out of every 10 income tax dollars that are collected in the state of Connecticut come from one of the 7 towns that I represent. So right now it's being asked of taxpayers in Wilton and Weston and Westport to subsidize inefficiency in a town like Sterling that chooses to hire its own superintendent. And that's not to say that we should force Sterling to do anything, and I've been pretty vocal in my opposition to forced regionalization. But I do want to remain in the room when it comes on the governor's bill, because that's how I think I can best serve this community, by making the necessary changes. I spoke to the governor last week and confirmed that they would take out the elementary school language to make sure that Wilton and Weston were protected. I spoke to the governor about how we can make this bill more about carrots than sticks. I even asked him, in the face of all of the uproar from my constituents, to come down to my community and talk to municipal leaders. I was really honored that he did that. He put partisanship aside. He came to Weston Town Hall. He spoke not only with First Selectman Spalding, but with municipal leaders from across the 26th district. And I think that they had a really productive conversation about how the state can be a partner in empowering towns and enabling them, and sometimes encouraging them to make efficient back office decisions. Maybe that means relief from binding arbitration. I'm certainly a supporter of SB 882. But there are all sorts of there are minimum budget requirements. There are state statutes that dictate how frequently a Board of Ed has to meet. There's a very small, not a very small, but there's a smaller town in my district, the town of Reading. And you don't represent Reading, do you, Tony?
No.
And I both share Reading. And it's the only town that would have been impacted by Senator Duff's proposal with fewer than 2,000. So I called him right away to find out what the impact would look like in that district. We read it carefully together, and they said, you know what? We already do a lot of this stuff. None of these bills call for closing schools and busing students to another community. They call for sharing a superintendent and sharing a back office administration, and Reading chose to do that voluntarily so that they can spend more money where it counts, in the classroom and on teachers, on new school supplies, and on students. So when Reading's doing it voluntarily but tell us that some state statutes have gotten in the way, the role of the state government should be to figure out how we can get the state out of the way so that towns that do pursue this voluntarily have an easier time doing so and can spend money where it counts most.
Thank you, and well, there it goes there. Thank you very much for having us. I remember this particular event last year when we went through this exercise with the tri-board. I don't know if you remember. The difficulty is we're confronted with dealing with this every single year. And I think for me, the biggest concern is this is regionalization. And all the bills that are being proposed are a precursor to regionalization. Now, you ask if those bills particular to the Looney and Duff and the governor's bill could be dead on arrival. I would offer to you that politically, we're not discussing it, but operationally, and a vision of how state government is going to proceed is very much still alive. And that's my concern, is the fact that we may not be talking about it by specific bill, but unfortunately, the actions and the process in budget planning and the very big package of bills that may be incorporated into the budget will reflect aspects toward regionalization. And we can talk about whether one bill's dead, one bill is alive, and all the nuances and being in the room. For me, it's really clear. We as legislators need to make it quite clear to the governor and to our respective leadership that these type of issues should not be raised. Because when you do that, you cause alarm, you cause uncertainty, and you move the process a little bit closer every single day to your ultimate goal. So I would ask of my fellow colleagues on both sides of the aisle, all across the state, that when these bills come forward, there is no room for deliberation. We need to come forth just as over thousands of individuals came forth to Hartford for the education testimony, and over 4,000 testimonies that were submitted related to these bills. The people spoke loud and clear. There is no if, and, or buts about this. And we as legislators need to hear that, and we need to evoke the same type of clarity, the same type of passion to say these issues are non-discussable. Because what it does is it creates that uncertainty, and it just creates so much turmoil to our respective boards and to our community, and ultimately to the educational system as we talk about regionalization. The concern about pensions is something that is very much alive and real. We may say regionalization is dead, but here's the fact. The pension issue is not going away. We're going to have deliberations on it, but nothing's really been scheduled about it. This town and all of the respective towns in the state cannot afford a 25% redistribution of pension. I feel very strongly about that, and I'm pretty clear about that. And I would hope that my fellow legislators, reflecting the interests of the community, speak equally clear about this. None of this kind of, let's talk about it. It is non-negotiable in my mind, because the burden that it places on our community is a direct tax increase and a direct impact on how our town's going to operate. I will never subscribe to a Hartford one-size-fits-all. And part of what I'm going to look from this meeting is to listen to the town leaders that operate on a day-to-day basis in the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, and the Board of Education, as well as from the community, that when we go up and represent you in Hartford, our message is loud and clear that we're going to protect the interests of this town. Granted, it's important that we have a constitutional mission in this state to ensure that every child has an opportunity to get the best education from K to 12. That being said, we should not be picking winners and losers. We should look to maximize and increase the allocation of funds to all of our schools to ensure that every aspect of our education is the best it can be. But to pick out winners and losers, to pick out communities versus others, it's not good governance. It's not reflecting the views that we have as a commitment to education. These alliance schools that we have in our state need great support. But that shouldn't mean that we undercut the quality and the commitment to education in our towns in order to facilitate that. The state should rise to the occasion to ensure that our constitutional mission is there to ensure that every single child in every single town gets the best opportunity to succeed through education. But I'm going to be clear. These bills are non-negotiable to me, and in my conversations with the governor, it's not that I want to sit and talk with you. It is clear these issues will not benefit the best interest and the long-term interest of the state of Connecticut.
Will, do you want to, since we moved on to the, we'll get back and everyone, but you just, since we opened up the pension transfer costs, you just want to give us your opinion on where you are on that?
Sure. I share Senator Wong's concern about the teacher pension sharing. As I said a lot on the campaign trail, and as I continue to believe today, it would not be fair for the state government, after decades of not saving responsibly and setting aside funds to all of a sudden say, well, we can't afford it now, so we're going to shift that cost onto the towns. Now, I do believe that we should look at our neighboring states and best practices and recognize that in many other places, teachers dutifully contribute. I believe it's 7% of their salary. In other states, the town contributes and the state contributes. In Connecticut, we've had a system of only teachers, as I'm sure you're all aware, but maybe not everybody. The teachers contribute and the state contributes, and the town doesn't have any skin in the game. Legacy obligations are a non-starter for me. I do not believe the town should be asked to bear legacy obligations. I was relieved that in the governor's budget, and some may believe that 25% is too high. I'm not sure that 25% is the right number, and I want to hear from all of you about the impact that might have on Weston's mill rate. But what we can at least, I think, perhaps agree on is that it's a good thing that we see normal costs being shared, meaning current teachers and future retirees, and not the shifting of pension obligations. I also have concerns about the salary differential that the governor put forward. I understand his intention here. Look, the reality is Weston pays teachers more highly than some communities in other parts of the state, and as a result, the pensions go up, so the state ends up bearing the cost of that increased salary. But there's another reality to reckon with, and that's the fact that Weston pays teachers more highly, partially in an effort to recruit better teachers, I believe. Board of Ed, please let me know, but also partially because the cost of living here is higher, and I don't think that the governor's statewide average reflects that. So what I've advocated for, and what I'll continue to advocate for, is if we are going to talk about the differentiation in teacher salaries, let's do it on a regional basis, whether you want to do it by COG or DERG or county. There are a lot of ways that we can figure out a more equitable and more representative method of determining just how different Weston is from our neighbors in terms of how we compensate teachers. So I'd be happy. I think we're all probably talking too much. Obviously, I want to hear Representative Hughes's view, but also I just want to hear from all of you about the teacher pension and what that might look like in Weston, so that I'm better aware of what we should be negotiating going forward.
And I'll let Representative Hughes answer in a second, but so this year, again, it's around 270,000-ish that we're getting with the 25% plus the 24% median escalator, basically. Each $135,000 is roughly 1% on the town's operating budget. So already we got 2% there. Next year that doubles, 4% there. Next year it goes up to 870,000. So we're talking 3 years out, we've got an 8% increase if I came in with a flat budget. That's real. And not everybody, while the median wealth of town is up there, there are people here who are struggling to make it through. And as I said earlier, by shifting these burdens from income tax to real estate tax, you're impacting those people too. So we have people who might not be able to live here, or might not be able to move here, or might have moved here and now are going to move and start having to, use social services because just this change. So that is a real impactful existing effect of this pushback. And I understand why it's happening, because at some point you got to address it, but it looks like the way it was being addressed was, like it or not, going to impact the towns you represent more than the rest of the state. They're capping the distressed towns at 5%, and those happen to be huge towns, huge cities that have huge needs, understandably. And because of that, since it's math, the rest of the small towns, particularly the more well-off towns, have to make that up. And so that's the real-world impact of that. And that's not even talking about the MERS, which is the other employee pension pushback, which is, again, 177,000, which is a little more than 1%. So you could see that all of this coming out of nowhere. I would have had a negative budget this year, and I'm not looking at anywhere close to that, just because of the stuff that just showed up now. So, that's real world. So I'm just talking real data. That's what happens here. Representative Hughes, please.
Thank you. Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah. We are faced with this challenge of both the legacy debt and the balloon mortgage, which is now due, and what you're talking about is normal costs that's going forward. The governor's proposal is unaffordable for our town. The schedule is unaffordable. And we will push back on that and make sure that that is not acceptable. But here's the thing I want to figure out. I have introduced a bill, as well as Senator Haskell, on increasing the earned income tax credit. I've introduced a bill, and I think that you might have signed on to it, about preventing cost rescissions mid-year to municipalities because of what happened when we didn't do our job as legislators. I mean, I wasn't there yet, but in terms of passing a budget. If you don't get a budget passed, you don't get the municipal grants and so forth that you've been promised, and that's unacceptable. I don't know if that bill will go anywhere, but that's exactly what Senator Huang was saying. We can't manage with that kind of uncertainty. So if we say, facing this $1.45 billion deficit that we can't have, that we cannot pass, and we cannot afford this property tax increase or burden on the municipalities for the teacher's pension in your district, I would like to look at creative ways to solve the issue of how can we equitably close that gap. And that's what I'm not hearing yet from our constituents. And I'm wondering, when you mention pilot payment in lieu of taxes, are there nonprofits that don't pay any pilot right now in town? Okay. Is there a way to look at creatively getting more pilot in order to, so that we can look at another way of the municipality making up the $800,000 that you would be required to come up with?
We would have to either take existing tax-paying entities and make them non-taxable, or we would have to somehow encourage universities and hospitals to move to Western, which...
No, we're talking about actually the universities and hospitals. First of all, we're talking about finding a way to fully fund payment in lieu of taxes, which the state currently doesn't do.
That's not being accrued by Weston.
It's not, unless we are redefining them economically, like you were talking about, as a cog, like as the Council of Governments, so that it's not just going to that zip code, but it's really going to the services and the community that is feeding those services.
Payment in lieu of taxes generally benefits large cities, regardless.
Exactly, the way it is designed now. And that's what I'm looking at. What creatively can we do to increase that basically source of investment into this community? Because, yeah, most of my whole district doesn't really have any universities and so forth, but Fairfield does. And so all of their payment in lieu of taxes is going right to that town.
I do not believe they're going to make up for what they're going to lose in car taxes either, is my understanding.
Okay.
So again, this is really big cities.
Yeah.
Particularly, we all know what the history of what happened in Hartford, but my guess is a lot of that money will be directed to very, very large cities.
Yeah, maybe. Yes.
How to solve that problem.
Right.
Basically, you're asking me to solve problems that originated in big cities.
I know.
Some solution in Weston, and that's not going to happen.
No, I know that. I'm saying, how can we creatively look at the solution without cutting essential services? We only, a third of our state budget is fixed costs. It's debt liability and fixed costs, like reimbursement rates.
If I may, I
Yeah.
mean, I think talking about these fixed costs, that's where I'm looking at this.
Great.
We keep hearing this about we have to deal with the pension problem. We have to deal with the pension problem. But where is the action in Hartford to deal with how you ended up in this problem? Meaning, the pensions were not moved over to defined contribution plans when they should have been. We have a single trustee system. Like, where are the controls in place in Hartford to make sure that the pensions are properly managed so we don't end up in this situation? The income tax was introduced in Connecticut in the early 90s to deal with this. We're now sitting here in 2019 with the problem bigger than ever, and your solution is, hey, Fairfield County, send us more money. Well, when are we going to see controls put in place to rein in the problem in the first place?
So let me, just so everyone understands what Gina's saying. So most of these conversations are about how we're going to raise money. We're going to either regionalize schools that will theoretically save us a superintendent, which is not that much money in the grand scheme of things, or we're going to increase teacher pension costs. So we raise $1, and then we hand it over into a system which is run by the state treasurer. And the state treasurer is what's referred to as a sole trustee. So there are 3 states in the United States, Connecticut, North Carolina, and New York, where the treasurer is a sole trustee, meaning the treasurer has unilateral authority without any oversight to manage the state pension plan. So this is long-standing in the state. And now we have a treasurer who's never managed money. He's a lawyer. He's written bond indentures, but he's never managed money. So he oversees a $30 billion pension plan, which has seen a turnover in CIOs, and I understand there may be another one coming, 5 or 6 in the last decade. One lasted 10 days, literally 10 days. And so there's an investment advisory committee. It's made up of 3 or 4 union members and a couple of people that have theoretical financial background. But this is a state, and this is a county, this is a community that has some of the best investment minds in the country. I mean, wouldn't you love to see our pension fund overseen by the fellow who runs Yale's endowment? He's legendary. Well, why would he do it? Because he'd have absolutely no say in how the monies are invested. So I would suggest to our representatives that the state treasurer's role be changed and have a true investment committee and do it like the other 47 states where there is a true CIO and state treasurer that can make investment decisions that are informed rather than the way it's been going on now for forever. And unless we do that, we'll be raising $1 and putting it into the hands of people who may or may not be qualified to manage it. And we have a big pension deficit to work on. It'd be very unlikely we'll earn our way out of it, but at least we should have a shot in trying to do it. But we should open this up to everyone else on the board.
Jump in with one thing, and I just want to share one thing with you that I actually shared with the governor because you're asking for suggestions. And while I don't have a solution to that specific problem, one thing I do have a conceptual solution to is because we're being treated in other places in terms of they're being capped at teacher pension payment normal cost at 5% and we're going up to 49%, how about we treat the unfunded mandates differently? We have 80 pages or something in the back of our Board of Ed budget of unfunded mandates that the state have put down, and a lot of them are very reasonable, but not for high-performing schools, okay? Not for places that don't necessarily need those controls, those restrictions put on them, and they are costly, both in terms of time, in terms of effort, and in terms of diverting resources away from students. So that's something I brought up to the governor, I'm bringing up to you, and I'm going to, and again, the argument was always, oh, you can't treat different towns differently. Well, now towns are being treated differently, so why not look across the board at looking at areas where maybe it can help us too. So just throwing that out there, and now let's open it up to the rest of the board.
If I may add, Senator Haskell, you asked for feedback from your constituents on what the impact of this was, and Representative Hughes, I found it very interesting that you said we need to look for some creative ideas on how we could address this issue, but you immediately went to raising funding. And I'm glad to hear Gene and Steve say it, because that's where I immediately went, is not in raising more money, but is in controlling spending. You cite that the state budget is 33% fixed costs. That, as a Board of Education member, is a number I envy, because our fixed costs are 97% of our budget. So if you're looking for an impact statement, when you're looking at shifting $250,000, $500,000, and $800,000 onto the towns, there's nowhere to go for that money. There's nothing to cut. Mm-hmm. My question for the three of you is, and I'd like to hear an answer to this, we have 36 state senators in Hartford. We have 151 representatives. Every single one of them represents a town that is going to be negatively impacted by the shifting of teacher pensions onto the municipalities. In some, it's going to be less, it's going to be 5%. In others, it's going to be higher, it's 50%. But every single senator and representative in Hartford represents people who are going to be negatively impacted when the teacher pension shifts. Why is anyone even considering this?
I don't know that they are, but this part in the budget, when the governor comes out and says, let's look at creative ways to close the gap, you know, we can say no to that, but what our job is to pass a balanced budget. So we have to at least consider, if not that, then what? And I'm excited to do a budget forum here in Weston, because I know Keith Fanoff came out and really described what the constraints are about how we can cut services, we can cut, you know, we can cut costs, but they also have a severe impact, and we can run those numbers as well, which I have asked the legislative office, commissioner's office, to give us the numbers on that. If we do cut, you know, certain initiatives, how that's going to impact exactly our residents here. And you know, this is part of the process of taking a hard look at that and what's doable, and making sure that's really transparent to our constituency before we implement anything. And the governor is just the governor. He's not the legislator. So he proposes this. We look at it carefully and say, this isn't viable, but he says, run the numbers, come back with an equation that works. If not this, then what? So that's what I'm working on.
I'd love to just jump in and say, look, I think the reason anyone is considering a teacher, and we can and should all have different views on what percentage that teacher pension sharing should be on a normal cost basis going forward. But I think the reason anybody is considering this is the fact that nobody would argue that the status quo is working. Nobody's argued that what's happening now, which is the state is only for the first time in many, many years making its annual required contribution, yet we're facing unbelievable legacy obligations. Nobody would argue that we can continue down this path, and I think that the state should have to pay for the mistakes that it made over the last few decades, but we've got to figure out a better way of doing this. We've got to figure out a more responsible way of governing. And Gina, I think you bring up really great points about reducing state spending. That's why, you know, I was relieved in the governor's budget to see that he wants to rein in state employee health care costs. That's going to save $135 million by the next fiscal year. He also supports something that I was pushing for throughout my campaign, and that's a reform in our cost of living adjustments. It's currently in state statute that even in a no inflation environment, state employees get a 2% cost of living adjustment. That just doesn't make any sense. And it may seem like a small thing, but ultimately it's going to save the state a lot of money if we make that a floor of 0, so that in no inflation environments, the cost of living reflects the accurate economic situation. Finally, Steve, we're on the same page regarding pension reform. I think you bring some really valuable ideas, and we should continue to talk about how we can implement them. But let's expand the fiduciary responsibility to the entire pension board. Let's most importantly, let's continue to make our annual required contribution. And finally, Chris, with regard to mandate relief, there's a lot of room within the school system, but also you and I have talked, I think, really constructively about how we can provide some mandate relief to towns. Ann and I are working on a bill right now that's really making a lot of progress in the Planning and Development Committee, and that's to provide some relief to towns like Weston that really don't have a town newspaper anymore. Reading is the same way, and yet state statute requires you to publish public notices in a physical newspaper. It's, in my view, in a print newspaper. I think that that's a 20th century law that just doesn't really work in the 21st century exchange of information. Ted's here, and he's offered to post all of Weston's public notices for free. That would be a tremendous cost savings. Your town administrator was nice enough to share with me what that might look like a few months back. And I think we have to continue that conversation. So I hope that, you know, this is one mandate that we're looking at, but I hope you'll continue to let us know, whether it's in the school system or in the on the town side of things, what mandates we can provide relief from so that towns can make more stable budget decisions going forward. And finally, it's so important that because municipalities build their budgets responsibly year after year, that the state, I can't say that the state's going to all of a sudden start acting responsibly, start passing budgets on time. I just don't have that power, but I can push for states not to impose its irresponsibility, its last-minute decisions, its volatility onto town governments. That's why we're pushing really hard for a bill that would reduce the governor's ability to reduce or withhold ECS funds in the middle of a fiscal year. It's also why I put in a bill that would allow town governments to adjust their fiscal year calendars to, if they so choose, to a federal calendar, which would better allow them to predict what's coming down the road from the state government. Because what I hear from a lot of members of boards of finance around these 7 towns is that they sometimes have to anticipate $0 coming from Hartford simply because you never know what you're going to get out of the legislature, and that's just no way to do business. It's not how you do it on the town level. It's not how we should do it on the state level, and we shouldn't impose as legislators in Hartford play politics with the budget. And I've only been there, a few months, feels like an eternity, but I'm rapidly finding out that people do play politics with the budget. That's not fair to pass down to our towns.
I'm sorry, Senator Wong, I definitely want to hear what you have to say, but, Senator Haskell, your comment begs the question, what are the politics that are being played with this budget that the fact that teacher pension costs, which negatively impact every single town, is still a topic that's even being discussed? And why aren't you taking the position that Senator Wong said he's taking with regards to regionalization, which is it's an item that is not up for discussion?
Do you mind if I respond?
Yeah.
I have a lot of respect for Senator Wong. He and I spent a long day together on the Higher Ed Committee. We get to work together quite a bit, but I disagree with him that regionalization is a dirty word. We have 169 towns in Connecticut and no counties. We haven't since 1958, and that's okay, but it means there are some inefficiencies, and there are opportunities for regionalism, voluntary, always, in my opinion, where there are cost savings. Westport right now is about to enter into an agreement to share a 911 call center located at the old GE campus. That's going to save them a lot of money because when the city of Houston has one 911 call center, why do we need to have over 150 in the state of Connecticut? Animal control facilities, water treatment plants. There are opportunities for towns to share services and create economies of scale, ultimately saving taxpayers and bringing mill rates down. So regionalizing our schools, forcing towns to do anything, I will always stand opposed to. But saying that no will be my answer to every regionalism proposal, I don't think is a constructive way of legislating, because ultimately no isn't a platform, and regionalism, I think, poses certain cost-saving opportunities.
With all due respect, Senator, that wasn't my question. My question is, why don't you take that approach with regards to teacher pensions?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought your question was about regionalism. With teacher pensions, I think, as I said earlier, I just don't think we can continue down the same path. I don't think our current system is working. We're just the state contributes and the teachers contribute. I do think that going forward, in a way that allows towns to make plans for the years and decades to come, we should have a conversation about having a skin in the game and absorbing some of the normal costs.
So having skin in the game, it goes back to my point earlier. The gross mismanagement that's happened in Hartford. This is a pension plan managed by Hartford that we're supposed to be contributing our tax dollars to, with no idea about what's being done to put proper controls in place, proper management in place. So there's got to be a little bit of an understanding of what is happening as far as reform to properly manage those pensions before you start asking us for more money. I mean,
So let's make it a condition.
I just really don't understand how our elected officials in Hartford have really not addressed. That's the elephant in the room. Yes, you've got money that's due to people, and those people are and should receive their benefits. But you have decades of gross mismanagement and a lack of controls that all you're doing is saying, give us more money. There has not been one word about how you're going to fix the true cause of the problem. And that's where I don't have comfort in saying, sure, it's fair to figure out a way towns, you've got to start chipping in. Yeah, fine. But let's make sure we're actually fixing the cause of the problem and not just a Band-Aid.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and that's why we've got to look at last best offer reforms, which obviously drive up costs for towns. And if you're going to have skin in the game, you ought to have a skin in the negotiation as well, of course, when you're determining teacher compensation. It's why also we need the sharing of fiduciary responsibility. We need those cost of living adjustments. We need to rein in state healthcare employee spending. I'm open to all of those things, but I think it's an and not an or, if I may. But I'm sorry, I'm taking up Senator Wong's time.
No, hey, our pension liabilities in the state of Connecticut didn't occur overnight. Both parties, administrations, 50 years in the making. the largesse that we continue to talk about and that my colleagues say is unsustainable, truly is. But I don't believe the majority of our state and its residents fully understand the enormity of that liability on the future of our residents. And I will compliment Governor Malloy for making the payments that are necessary that were past due. But we have a system that needs to be changed, beginning with what you addressed. What you just shared, I would offer to say, most people don't understand, that we have a sole trustee that manages by one individual the investment strategy and decision-making in our state. And our past treasurer and our current treasurer doesn't have finance management background. How does that happen? And when you look at the positive bill that we're considering under this governor of increasing contributions from the percentages that is currently in statute, it sounds logical. But there's going to be a fight to that effect. The other factor is we have not, and to go back again, we have not been honest with the people of the ticking time bomb that we have in liabilities and pensions. That being said, this was the state's doing. This was the state's responsibility to our valued teachers. That was the deal that was struck. And we have to respect and honor that, but we have to understand, let's put the blame game past us. Let's address the problem now. We have to take a look at increased contributions. We have to take a look at better vehicles to be able to maximize our returns on our pensions. But we shouldn't be taking the easy way out to saying 25% should be your responsibility on the municipalities. And what you mentioned earlier, Selectman Spalding, is this. You're looking at numbers that you know right now for 3 years. If the state continues its irresponsible lack of management of the teacher's pension liabilities, your liabilities of 25% is incalculable from an exposure standpoint, and you have no control over it. So when I say emphatically that 25% of redistribution of the state's teacher pension to our community is a non-starter, there is no conversations about it, that the state should get its house in order, manage your finances properly, and manage your liabilities to the promises you made properly instead of off-putting it to the community. You have to be that forceful and you have to be that clear, because the problem is if you give them an inch in Hartford, they're going to take a mile. They've demonstrated that. So I say for me as a legislator, and I would encourage all of my legislators, the room for conversation on the 25% goes no further than it's a bad idea. Now let's get back to how we fix the problem. Because in transferring 25%, you're not fixing the problem. What we have repeated over and over again, you'll hear, and you'll hear this in the news, it's all about revenue, revenue, and more revenue. Nowhere do I see significant structural cuts to how government is run at the state level. You do it every single day because of your accountability to the taxpayers of Weston, to the students, to the families, to our seniors. You do it every single day. There is no accountability. What was described as suggested savings have not materialized in the health care as well as the increased contribution because, unfortunately, the state of Connecticut is bound by a 10-year labor contract that does not allow us to make these kind of changes. And if a union doesn't come to the table, because contractually they're not bound to, then we are again looking to simply increase revenue. That is not the way we need to move forward. Because again, as I said about forced regionalization, as I talked about the pension issue, this sends a very mixed, if not a negative message to the rest of the country about our state's ability to compete. It sends a message to our constituents and to our businesses that you don't have your act together, and as a result of that, we're going to have to carry the load. We have to be very conscious. We consider hundreds of bills in the General Assembly. A lot of them mean very well. A lot of them have great intentions. But we need to fully understand every one of those bills comes with a cost. And if we can't take care of the basic constitutional requirements of taking care of our seniors, the safety net, and K through 12, we shouldn't be considering additional costs onto our taxpayers. It's really simple to me. Households don't do it. Local municipalities don't do it. Why do we now in Hartford, despite the transformative statements made by the governor with his budget, but everybody felt afterwards that his budget was a continuation of looking at more revenue and no significant structural cuts? We need to reshape what we do in Hartford and stop talking about we need this, we need that, and instead say, what are our priorities? To me, the priorities are educating our kids, ensuring public safety, ensuring that the important things that make this community important in every state, in every town and city in our state, matters, instead of being locked up in long-term binding contracts that we can't change to create equity and fairness. So, I mean, I would encourage my colleagues in the legislature that sit with me right here to be equally forceful in making that statement to their leadership and to the governor, and to say, the pension redistribution, unacceptable, fix your problem, our forced regionalization. What we need to remind them is the fact that we have regionalization. In the town of Reading and Easton, you have a regional high school. That was done voluntarily. That was done because the community thought it was best. A best fit, a best consolidation, and a best result. Again, as I prefaced in the beginning of this, Hartford's one-size-fits-all doesn't work in the state. We had county government before. Let's take the best of what we have and make it work so that we can move forward in the state.
Can I say something? There's something I wanted to emphasize on this. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. And it's not just about the transfer of pensions, but it's the creation of winners and losers. One of the problems with the Malloy bill, besides being fundamentally flawed, one of its great flaws 2 years ago, was intentionally created winners and losers among the towns. This does it in its own way, too. It's not a 25% bill, a 25% of so-called normal costs, teacher pension costs. This punishes states like Reading, which is going to be the number 2 in the state. It is the number 2 in higher than median teacher salaries. Greenwich is 1, Wilton is 3, Weston is 4. You've got numbers 2 and 4. And Easton is not that far behind. It punishes them. It nearly doubles the Weston contribution from where it should be, or you would think, at 25%. And they really rub it in when this becomes the reason to reduce the ECS funding to those towns. So not only do they charge more, they give less. Now, this was considered by some people that I've read a great improvement over the Malloy attempted grab, or what it was called in his message, I remember from 2 years ago, required contributions from the town. That's an interesting oxymoron, a required contribution. Some people have said, after I listened to the governor, well, that's fair. After all, those towns, they voluntarily paid their teachers so much more. Well, I'm sure that every town in the state wants to have the best teachers they can get. And it's more than the salary. There's a lot of other things that go into somebody's decision, and particularly quality of life in those jobs. But what's missed too, and I have not heard it brought up, is that a lot of the reason why you've got the Greenwiches and the Westports and the Westons and the Readings, you've got Durg A and Durg B districts, for the most part, that are in that top area, because how are these contracts negotiated? They are under a state law, basically, that requires a certain process, specifically for certified educators. It's been on the books for about 40 years after there was a school strike in Connecticut, and this was the way the state was going to solve it. I was involved in 4 of those negotiations since 2006, I believe. And I would have loved to have been able to say, from my side, well, I think we're going to offer you the median state salary for your level. So how did we get so high, much higher up? Because where are we compared? I'm telling you, this is true. I've been through this with now 4 mediations and 1 arbitration. What was it about? You can't say someplace else in the state. It's always similar districts. They're trailing settlements and similar districts. What are they looking at? Reading, Wilton, Darien, Ridgefield. And it reinforces itself. And when that base starts growing, then it compounds over the years. Those districts tend to take off. It's not that you willingly said, oh, let's have the highest paid teachers in the state. We'll get the best that way. I think we get a lot of the best because of the quality of life, actually, for the job. All right, but I wanted to point that out. If that keeps coming up, I find that a very annoying thing, and it is disingenuous, to say the least. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that process up, because it's not in a vacuum, right? I mean, my parents moved here because my dad wanted to be a teacher in one of the best school districts in the country. And so he was for 35 years and retired. And as you know, teachers don't get Social Security, and they are, you know, going into public service based on not just a actual contract, but a social contract, that because it's rewarding, because these are the best teachers. And you know, my concern about this is it's going to hit teachers really hard, because what if, you know, municipalities say, well, we're just not going to pay that, then we're going to pay you this. Then they
can't.
Well, I know, but what if they do over any new teacher now? Any new teacher you could say, I'm not going to pay you this, and we're going to increase, you know, costs. And the reason that you get such a high quality is because these are incredibly qualified people with their 7th year, their experience, the top of the field. And that should be a viable thing, that we don't take out on the workers themselves that have committed themselves to public service. So I am very concerned about the impact, not just on municipalities, but on the public, on this public profession of teaching. It ought to be a viable thing that we commit to, especially going forward, and that teachers know what they're getting. because they could go somewhere else and instead of coming here if they're not equitable. And this is 7 decades of underfunding. I remember in the 90s getting tax rebates from the state. We had no business getting tax rebates from the state when we weren't putting in anywhere near our required contribution. We restructured that debt under the Rowland administration and again under the Rell administration to be a balloon mortgage, which is now due. That's why we're facing this crisis over the next 7 years. And one of the things in the governor's budget is restructuring teachers' pension to draw out that debt liability longer instead of this big increase arm over the next 7 years. So
one other thing that no one remembers is that we sold $2 billion worth of debt.
Right.
Pension obligation bond a few years ago.
Yes.
And the coupon on that we can't earn.
Right.
So
right.
we thought we paid down part of the pension
right.
plan. We've actually
it's a debt due now.
Yeah,
yes.
It's just,
it's a balloon mortgage that's now due. That's what we're faced with. And we can't have a deficit budget like the federal government. We can't just say, well, that's a deficit. We actually, those debts are due. So when I'm talking about a third fixed, I'm talking about owed, not just fixed. I'm talking about owed. Actually, it's more like 2/3 are fixed when we think about in the traditional way of fixed income for the whole budget.
Just in the interest of time, and I would, well, Samantha go, but then I want to get back to SB 431.
Oh,
because
that was my question.
Okay, so basically this is the elephant in the room, and again, interesting that this hasn't gotten a play that I would have expected it to, because for us alone, again, it's $3.4 million. I don't have any expectation any of that comes back. What's your understanding of this? And I know I've heard Senator Haskell talk about how we need to equalize and how it's not fair that a Prius in Bridgeport pays the same taxes as a Tesla in Greenwich.
You stole my line.
But there are ways to solve that, like capping everybody's car tax mill rate at a certain level. This way, again, is the umpteenth time that there's an attempt to sort of redistribute, piggyback, and to say, I mean, and again, this is hitting, the reason this is so salient now is these things are hitting us simultaneously, all at the same time, and they all have the same concept underneath that, hey, you guys are wealthy, you need to help out more than other people, and I understand that. But just going back to the pension, to the teacher issue, right? If we were to pay the teacher the median state average salary, those teachers would actually have a lower quality of life than somebody living in the other parts of the state, because we have a differential electric rate than the rest of the state. We have differential gas prices. We have differential grocery prices, everything else. So a teacher that would be compensated the same way here in the northeast corner of the state would have a worse quality of life here. So it's just not even conceptually feasible to go down that path. So the mathematics of it, I understand why it was done and how it works out, but the net effect of it is going to be much more problematic, and I don't know if people contemplated these unanticipated, although I'd argue anticipated effects from this. So I really strongly encourage you to go back and look at that. That said, SB 431, what is your understanding of where this is, how likely it is to happen, and what your position is on it? Because we cannot healthily absorb $3.4 million added to our budget right now. I mean, we're talking, you know, $10, $15, $20,000. We have hour-long arguments about that. I can't even conceive $3.4 million in our budget in a given year. So just, I wanted your thoughts on that before you get away from it, and then I'll let everybody else jump in.
We encountered it last year, and what happened was we were supposed to make the towns that lost the high mill rates, like Bridgeport, that had a mill rate of 58, and I think we capped it at like 24. Excuse the numbers. But Bridgeport was actually short $9 million and never got the money. If you read 431, it's interesting in the sense that it's looking at capping it to 15, or starting at a 15 mill rate, capping at no more than 19. And we're supposed to take the money at the state and give that back to you in the form of 3 particular one that I have in your notes here. And thank you, your notes were actually quite good. Yeah. You're looking at redistribution of pilot reimbursements. Well, you don't get much in Weston. Increase in special education grants. You don't get much in that in excess education costs. And then it's going to redistribute education funding for alliance school districts. Again, it's another example of redistribution, picking winners and losers. But I would caution, as we kind of go this road of 25% pension, different taxes, tolls, and all the other fees that we increase, we're not calling it tax increases, we're calling it fee increases. Here's the problem. Do people remember that the motor vehicle tax was supposed to be temporary? Right? Once people get used to revenue, they expect that to be around. And so, as I repeated earlier, we've not demonstrated the discipline in state government to make hard structural changes in making cuts. All we've talked about is revenue, revenue, revenue. So unless we as a legislative body and the administration of Governor Lamont demonstrate that we're going to make significant structural cuts and how government operates, we have to be very cautious of any of these schemes that says we're going to take your money one way and we'll give it back to you another. It hasn't worked. It has never worked. We tried to do that with the hospital through Medicaid reimbursement. What we're finding out is we're going to owe our value hospitals millions of dollars because of our Medicaid shortfalls. This kind of idea, this kind of financial rejiggering, or I would dare say even gimmickry, will always ultimately fall and the burden borne by our local municipalities. So again, let me be clear. I am not supportive of this because it is a misguided and ultimately, in my opinion, a miscalculation that will put most of the burdens on our municipalities.
And Senator Wong, do you think since this was defeated in the last cycle that this will not succeed in this cycle?
Actually, it was not defeated. It was put into 2 years ago, the budget.
Okay.
And what we realized was it fell apart because we didn't have the appropriate money to reimburse. So in this way.
So do you think this is a non-starter? You know, we've talked about some of the other bills here that were introduced to start a conversation. Is this a bill that has been introduced to start a conversation, or is this a bill that we should have real concern about because our, you know, like the first selectman and the chairman of the Board of Finance, I have real concerns about this because with our reval that we just had, our revenue from car tax was hurt far less than our home values. So, you know, this is a revenue that we do rely on, and by losing this revenue, it would be a significant hit for us.
I do believe you need to be concerned about it. And I think because even in this sheet you laid out, the redistribution of the money collected or withheld has particular guidelines to distribution. So Weston is not an alliance school district. You do not have a lot of pilot. Immediately on those two areas, you lose. All right? You lose the shortfall in the revenue that you'll be collecting. The money goes to the state, and you're supposed to trust state government to get it back to you. But under this proposed formula, it is a redistribution of your income. Again, nothing is ever dead until the budget is signed. I remember in my experience, we did one budget that had 800 pages, and there were over 120 bills that died in committee and died in debate. But miraculously, they ended up in the budget implementer and became law. So I would offer to you, to the community, be vigilant, be forceful, and be very, very cautious. Because ultimately the bill will be borne by you and the resident taxpayers, in my opinion.
Well, I think, I'd like to say that one message I can send you back with for sure is that Hartford should be focusing on getting their own house in order and not pushing taxes down on the towns like they're doing. And this idea that they can solve our problems, we know their track record. So I'm completely opposed to any forced regionalization in any of these spending bills, putting taxes back on the town.
Sure, I'd love to address 431 in that same statement I mentioned a while back, where a few Democrats from New Canaan, myself included, came out against Senator Looney's bill. That included 431. I think it's our job in the legislature to make this a more affordable state for every generation. That's why on Thursday, Senator Wong and I will be reporting a bill out of committee, the Live Here, Learn Here program, so that recent Connecticut graduates can afford to buy their first home. It's why I proposed a repeal of a phase out of the estate tax and a repeal of the tax on Social Security, because that's income that's already been taxed. No matter what generation you are in Connecticut, we need to make sure that this is an appealing and affordable state. So that's why imposing a statewide property tax, I think, is the wrong direction. And honing in for a moment on the car taxes, this is a huge cause of concern. In Weston, it's around $3 million. In Wilton, it's around $7 million. We've got to address what I think is a broken system regarding how we tax vehicles, but this is not the way to do it. I do believe there is a way to hold towns harmless, and I think capping it, creating a statewide cap on car taxes is a really interesting point. First Selectman Spalding mentioned, as I often talk about, and as many are interested in reforming, it isn't right that a Prius in Bridgeport has more taxes paid upon it than a Ferrari in New Canaan, right? That makes it harder because of wildly divergent mill rates. It makes it harder for working families to buy a car, to get their kids to school every day, to travel to work every day. So creating a system where car taxes are a bit more stable across our 169 municipalities, I think, is a valuable discussion. But taking those funds away from towns altogether and then redistributing according to these guidelines, I don't think is the answer. We heard a lot about winners and losers tonight, and I think it's worth noting that if you travel around at all in Connecticut, as I'm sure all of you do, because it's not a big state, the reality is that there are already winners and losers, and a lot of them who find themselves on the losing side are children, right? In Bridgeport, students have $13,000 a year spent on their education, whereas in Westport it's closer to $20,000. So when we have a conversation about providing greater budget stability for municipalities, how to hold towns harmless, how to make sure that the amazing quality of education that's given to students in Weston every year it can continue, I think that has to be paired with a conversation about bringing every district up, not bringing some districts down, but about making sure that the best practices in this community are shared across the state. That's why I'm pushing hard for greater representation from some high-performing districts on that. Just not to return to the school regionalism bill, but in the governor's commission that he creates, I do think that we should be hearing from efficient and effective districts like Weston on that commission, and I hope that there'll be somebody from either the town government or the school administration who might be willing to serve on that commission if the governor so chooses. Finally, I just want to talk about one of the redistributive mechanisms that's in this bill, and that's the only one that really I would support, and it's increasing special education grants. As I'm sure the Board of Ed and the Board of Finance see every day, part of the huge cause of volatility in municipal budgets is the fact that a student can enter the school system with very high costs, whether it's transportation and outplacement or whether it's within the school system, and that's very hard to predict year to year. You never know when that family might move into town, and of course public education doesn't have an asterisk, right? Every student, regardless of their individual needs, deserves a high quality education, and I don't even really like the term special education. It's just education. That being said, I think the state should play a role in helping towns smooth out their budgets and provide greater stability and predictability. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, but maybe members of the public aren't, there is an excess cost reimbursement formula that says the state will step in and provide funding if a individual pupil exceeds the per pupil cost by 4.5 times. The problem is the per pupil cost in a town like Weston is around $20,000 because it's a smaller district, and it creates a system where the state steps in very infrequently to help towns smooth out their budgets. And I proposed a bill along with a few other of my colleagues, I believe Democrats and Republicans, but I'll check back on that as to who's actually added their name to the bill. But it would bring the threshold down to 2, so that if an individual student enters your school system and the cost of educating that student exceeds 2 times what it costs to educate one of their classmates, at that point I think the state should step in and provide some help to the municipality. So that's a form of aid that I do think the state can have a role in playing when it comes to town governments.
Your unified outcry and our collective testimony has made a difference in that forced regionalization of any kind is a non-starter, and that's why it is dying in committee. Where the property tax bill is, Samantha, to your question, I don't really know with certainty. Again, it's not coming before my committee yet, and I don't know the people that are heading that up. So I'm happy to invite any and all of Weston to the public hearing scheduled on March 15th before the Finance Committee. And, let's amplify this voice that this is not a way to deal with our, like I said, $2 billion deficit. It's very problematic. I'm also asking the governor to drop the means test for the Medicare Savings Program to our senior citizens. They have paid into it. Again, this is their benefit regardless of their assets, that they should be able to count on the Medicare Savings Program. And that is something, but we also have to look at very directly, then what are we going to cut to get our house in order? And we've already shrunk the size of our government under the Malloy administration with good reason. And as a result, DSS is not very well staffed. There is still a 2-hour wait period when you call them on the phone. We have to pay back our hospital costs, as Senator Huang, and our reimbursement, our Medicaid reimbursement rates. 70% of that is senior citizens living in long-term care facilities. They're on Medicaid. Most of that is coming from the federal government, but the state is responsible for that last third of a piece. And so these are when I say fixed costs, there's actually more than that are fixed costs. They are what we owe, what we reimburse for services that our citizens use. So I am wide open to looking at creative ways to restructure the costs of state budget, but we only have 2 layers of budget, municipal and statewide. We have no county government. So it's actually our state government is a little bit cheaper than our counterparts because we have flattened out both of those levels of services and state workers.
So you'll be opposing 431?
I'll definitely be opposing 431 with all of my vigor that I don't have on that committee. But I'm gonna bring y'all with me, and we can testify.
So again, people are hearing on this one. Letters might be a good idea. That said, I want to see if there's anyone else on the panel who has questions, because I do want to give the public who showed up in mass the opportunity to ask questions and share their thoughts too, so you understand, or at least maybe they differ from us and maybe they have differing opinions, and you should hear from them. We can tend to be occasionally in our own little bubble. So anyone else on? Jeff?
Yeah, just what is the rationale for the HB 7319 Act concerning fiscal independence? Who brought that about, and what is it proposing to accomplish?
Yeah, I spoke to the sponsor yesterday about the bill. He's the former, his name is Representative Jeff Curry. He's the former Board of Ed chair in East Hartford. he doesn't view this. I want to be clear. I'm in no way defending this bill. I've already come out against it. He doesn't view this as a part of the regionalization conversation at all. Instead, it's interesting to talk about this with all the boards convened in one setting, because he spoke about his experience as a Board of Ed chair in fighting with the Board of Selectmen, trying to agree on a budget. And basically, this would provide school districts with an opportunity to create an autonomous taxing district. I don't think it's the way forward. I don't think that the state government should get involved in those municipal budget disputes between the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education, let alone the Board of Finance. But that's Representative Curry. As I have, best understand it, that's his intention. Luckily, as soon as I spoke to him, I went and talked to the chair of Planning and Development. She assured me that the bill, it will have a public hearing, and that after that it is dead. So if you're going to advocate, please join me in advocating, and Representative Hughes and Senator Wong, in advocating against SB 431, because feel free to also write about 7319, but I'm far more concerned about the other bill. I think your time is more efficiently spent elsewhere.
So will I reach out to Senator Casano, who's the co-chair of that, as well as the representative from Fairfield, although she didn't respond. Senator Casano came back very quickly and basically said, bad idea, ill-conceived, not a chance.
Yeah.
So, okay.
And that's what I heard from the representative from Fairfield as well.
No, because this actually did blow up huge on social media the past few days, and again, it's good for you to clarify its status, because then we could really focus on some of the stuff that needs to be focused on.
But I simply wanted to add, this is another example. I think as Will and I serve as ranking member, and he the chair of higher education, there is a responsibility that we have as leaders of a committee to evaluate and vet bills. The damage that raising something like this just nicks a little bit more of saying, I can't believe that they're thinking this way in Hartford. Because we have thousands of bills that don't get raised. The fact that you raise this bill and you don't believe in it causes so much turmoil. I think that's, again, the reason. So if we're doing something to help somebody, great, let's talk about it. But don't, as a committee of cognizance in planning and development, raise this bill, create the confusion and the anxiety of a taxing district, because this is what's going to happen. Every bad bill that we present that have the best of intentions but ill consequences is going to be used by somebody from Westchester who's trying to sell a home and said Chappaqua and Scarsdale has more stability. And it's going to impact the quality of our life in communities. So we as legislators have an important responsibility, in my opinion, to not raise bills that reaffirms once and again that regionalization is around the corner. And if we don't believe in that, don't raise it. Maybe that's too simple.
Okay. Again, so we're going to open it up to the public now. Anybody, there's a lectern over there, podium with a microphone. Just try and get about 5 or 6 inches away from it if you want to come and say anything at this point. So come on up, anyone. We answered all your questions? No, good.
Hi.
Hi.
I actually grew up in Connecticut and went to a regional school. I lived in Bethany, which is about half the amount of people is here. We had a superintendent of school for elementary, so in terms of wasted resources, we had that going for us.
Was that in addition to a principal, if you don't mind my asking?
Of course, yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, and then we basically had to go to school from, for an hour on the bus all the way from where we lived all the way to Woodbridge in middle school and high school. So,
should you ask him to
The
identify?
choices we made when we came back here were, where would we live? And looking at Weston with
Hey,
one.
Jason, could you just, and anybody who comes up, can you identify your name and your street address, please?
You just outed me. My name is Jason. Revs on. I live on Birch Hill Road, and it's the other side of the road from you, so it's on your side. So when we looked at it, one of the, Connecticut, I think, for the better part, is a series of experiments. Each town's its own experiment, and they do things different ways. And you could look at it, and you could make choices. And the choice we made was, here's a town, it's very small, has direct government, has all the schools in one street, really cares about it, and you can have a direct impact, which hopefully we've had, making those decisions and making it a better place and working on that. And the regionalism and the other things we hear flies in the face of that. That goes directly to what I consider taxation without representation. We're essentially saying, I'm going to send my kids an hour to some other town and some other place where they are not making great decisions in order to essentially bow to the state. We have a great example that I was just stuck on for an hour and a half or 20 minutes longer than I thought I was going to be coming up here, which is the MTA, Metro North. So if anyone wants to see regionalism in action, I mean, has anyone here ever voted on anyone who runs the MTA or Metro North? Do we have any choice in the matter? No. And all the things we're hearing about, all the things we're looking at are examples of that, where essentially we're taking money from us, giving it to a third party to spend for another third party, and it's this sort of wasteful thing that we're talking about. So I'm glad to hear that you're all in somewhat of agreement that we need to be cutting on spending, but I haven't heard anything concrete in terms of, okay, all new teachers have to have a defined contribution plan, or all, state things have to, spending has to be lowered. We heard about balanced budget, but that's tolls. That's, bringing things up. It's not cutting the spending down. We've heard about a Prius in Bridgeport costing the same as a Ferrari somewhere else, and not questioning why does it cost so much to have a Prius in Bridgeport. Why are we not talking about lowering what we're taking and lowering what we're spending in this? So that's really my point.
If I may, look,
Yeah.
you should come up to Hartford. I agree. But be wary. We just voted in transportation to create a transportation authority,
Right.
which will take the vote out of legislators' hand in creating an entity like Metro North, which is billions of dollars in debt, but has no legislative control.
Right.
So be wary. It's
No,
happening
I'm-
everywhere.
So, and one other thing I would say is just that I've heard the definition of democracy as two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner. And that's what this sounds like. Just numerically, we don't have that many people here who are able to vote compared to the more populous areas of the state on this. But at the same time, because we talked about the means of the people in town, I bet a lot of people here contributed to the governor and contributed to people they may or may not agree with in terms of running for office. And I think we have a direct way of affecting that, which is don't cut off anyone who has any semblance of being able to, take from us and essentially give to others. And just don't write that check. Don't host that fundraiser. Don't give to a party. Don't. So that's what I like to say.
Thank you.
If I might respond for a second, if you want to partner on legislation to take money out of politics, I think that'd be a great thing. In Connecticut, luckily, we have the citizens election program, which means you only have to raise a much smaller amount than anybody who runs for the federal government, but it's not enough. We still had to spend, at least I had to spend 2 weeks fundraising, and only then could I start asking for votes and not checks. With regard to the Prius in Bridgeport, you mentioned the fact that we're not talking about the fact of why it has higher taxes paid upon it. It's because 50% of towns like Hartford or Bridgeport have that pilot payment in lieu of taxes property as compared to 7.8% in Weston. So there are real structural problems that we have to fix. No, it's not churches, it's not-for-profits, it's universities, it's affordable housing, it's all sorts of property that they're not able to collect taxes on. And whether we want to argue about how to fix that. I would love to. I was going there. So let's talk about the bonding cap, which I think is a good idea. It was put in place last session, and now the governor has suggested a debt diet. And that was, interestingly, I think the only thing in his speech that got zero applause. None from Democrats and none from Republicans, because everybody realized that it's going to mean an end to the practice of playing politics with appropriations, of pork barrel legislation, of putting in a request for your district and telling voters 2 years later, look, here's what I built. The governor has proposed bringing us down from 1,500 million roughly to 960 million annually in bonding. That's a major reduction, and it's forced all of us, whether we're Democrats or Republicans, to rethink some of the appropriations requests that we're putting in. I think the most concrete example that I can think of is I represent a train district, a train station in New Canaan. It's the only train station in the state that doesn't have a covering over the railroad, and that doesn't seem like a big deal, and maybe it isn't, but commuters have to sit in the rain or sit in their cars idling or sit in the snow, as the case has so often been lately. So I thought it would be a pretty simple request to put in a bonding request to put a covering over that railroad station. Well, due to some problems in our prevailing wage laws that have to be updated because they haven't been in 26 years, then that drives up construction costs. I got the bill back, and it cost $4 million to put a railroad covering. So I think now I'm going to pivot and in my role up there and start trying to sorry? Well, I think we have to have a really honest conversation about how to bring down construction fee costs in our state, and I'm going to hesitate before putting in that $4 million appropriation request, given the debt diet that we've all been placed on. And I think it's the right thing to do because bonding ultimately is a tax on all of us, and most importantly, a tax on the next generation that we're passing on. It's deferring payment onto future taxpayers. So that is a significant spending cut that I support, even though obviously it's difficult for every legislator in every district because everybody has that one thing they want to build, whether it's a railroad covering or a playground or a new school.
I'm as frustrated with you with the lack of transparency and accountability that's been going on for decades, and I'm so proud of our district and for people like you for paying attention, showing up, staying engaged, and making your voices heard, because this is why we passed overwhelmingly the referendum for the transportation lockbox. We're sick of these being rated and not being used for what the revenue is supposed to be. If we're going to pay a gas tax, it should be going back into our roads and bridges. We know we have falling apart roads and bridges. We know we have to fix them. And that is overwhelmingly the public will saying, let's do what we got to do, fix what we got to fix, but we're not willing to raid that for other things. So I'm with you on that. Let's show some accountability in this budget. Let's show some equity in this budget. Let's show some fairness and be a solution caucus, because that's basically our job right now.
Hi, my name is Joe Castro. I live on Charles Path. And on the pension costs, it was very eye-opening for me tonight. On the pension costs, it was very eye-opening tonight to find out that we have someone managing $30 billion who has no experience. I'm in the financial industry, and to me, that's criminal. Absolutely. One suggestion could be, and I think, one of the representatives said it, we have one of the best minds managing the Yale Endowment Fund, with stellar returns. Yale University pays no property taxes as a tax-exempt university. How about if the state said, you want to keep your tax-exempt status? You're going to manage our pension for free. Very simple, or at least guide us. Because you know what? There's expertise, and I'm sure that they would do it to keep that tax-exempt status. Well, Representative Hughes, you asked for solutions. I love it. There we go. There are creative ways to come up with things instead of throwing more money at a bad solution. And to Gina's point, we need to fix the problems in Hartford. The way money is managed and the way money is thrown around, those are the things we need to fix. We can't keep throwing good money after bad, especially after years and years of mismanagement. One other question that I do have, and this is actually directed toward Senator Haskell. I heard you speak at the Women's League a couple of weeks ago, and I've heard you tonight. And for 22 years old, you've really gotten the political speak down pretty quickly, in my opinion. You say you're against forced regionalization, but there are times I've heard you speak about incentivized regionalization. And as Senator Wong said, give an inch and Hartford will take everything. And I think if we give in on incentivized regionalization where it's going to penalize towns like Weston, we're going to be in trouble. And this is exactly what Senator Wong alludes to. If we give them that, it's only a step in the wrong direction. And I think the people of Weston and the people of Wilton and the people of Reading are against any type of regionalization. So my question to you is very simple, yes or no answer. Will you vote yes or no? Will you vote against Senator Lamont's bill?
The governor's
Lamont's, I'm
bill.
sorry.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and no, I wouldn't vote for it as it's currently drafted. I have found out that the fastest way you can lose a seat at the table and no longer be able to advocate for your district is to come out against something. So I have been, instead of just saying no, 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 trying to work with the governor's team in terms of how to improve this bill, how to protect Weston and Wilton and Westport and Reading and the other towns I represent from the negative impacts. I'm not sure where in the bill it would expose Weston or any of the other towns to potential negative consequences. I understand the slippery slope argument, but if we subscribe to that in its entirety, it means we can't do anything in Hartford because any bill might be amended at the last minute and could become forced regionalization. If it does, I'd oppose it. I'll always oppose forced regionalization. But incentivizing is fundamentally, in my view, not the same thing as forcing, unless you want to say that we force people to buy electric cars or install energy-efficient utilities in their own home. What the bill would do, as I understand it, is it would reduce an education cost-sharing grant by the size of a superintendent's by the amount of a superintendent's salary in a district with fewer than 2,000 students that chooses not to regionalize. They have the freedom to do so, but they can't limit. If I just can finish, but they can't send the bill to Hartford for that inefficiency. The other thing it would do is prioritize districts in the state's bonding list of priorities in terms of school construction that have regionalized, and it would deprioritize those districts with fewer than 2,000 that choose not to regionalize. Here's the thing about Weston in particular, or really any of the towns I represent with the exception of Bethel. You can't deprioritize us anymore when it comes to school construction funding. There's a floor of 20% state reimbursement for renovations and 10% for new school construction, and that's about the rate that Weston gets. It's exactly the rate that New Canaan gets. So we're already at the bottom of the priority list. There's really not much in the way of incentives that would have a negative impact on this town. I think if this bill were to be amended in a way that I could someday support, it would instead look to towns like Reading, where they've done this voluntarily and figured out what got in the way and how can we empower towns to make similar cost-saving decisions in very small districts so that they can spend more money in the classroom where it really counts. And I, with all due respect, I don't think that's political doublespeak. I think I've been pretty clear about my position from day one in opposing forced regionalization.
No, and you have. It's the slippery slope of the incentivized regionalization. And if towns, and maybe not Weston, maybe it could be Reading or Easton, that could be penalized. And I don't think if someone chooses not to do something that they should be penalized. And that's where I stand on that point.
I appreciate those comments, and I certainly think that I agree with the governor in what he said at Weston's town hall. I think it was a week ago, maybe two. He said, let's emphasize the carrot and not the stick. That's certainly the direction I would like for the bill to move in.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Namuk Cho. I'm at Walnut Lane. I've been in Weston since '01, and I have to agree with Joe that Governor Lamont's proposal, it's basically, to me, it's a carrot, and it's a stick in the shape of a carrot. I wouldn't want to go there. I think it's a very slippery slope. That aside, I just want to bring up two macro issues that I hope that you folk in Hartford will keep into consideration as we keep taking the angle of raising taxes, raising revenues. And the two macro factors are, first of all, the impact of the SALT, right? State and local taxes limitations. I did a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation on the town of Weston, and if you use our home values and the mill rate and cap the deductibility at $10,000, you'll figure out that the impact is at least $20 million, as in the amount that we as residents collectively cannot deduct anymore from our federal taxes. That's just Weston alone, and that's like the minimal. It's probably higher toward closer to 30 million. So extend that analysis out to 150, however many towns, and the picture's not pretty. Having said that, it's also near impossible to figure out what the real impact is because it just depends on the individual's situation, your AMT threshold, your deductibilities, your tax setup, who knows, right? Your tax bracket, it's very complicated. But the point is as follows. These types of things that is happening at the macro level, right, these represent a reduction in our net income or an increase in our overall taxes or costs. And that has an economic contraction effect on the state of Connecticut, we as consumers. And these things are not one-to-one, right? For every dollar of economic contraction that we experience, it most likely has some kind of a multiplicative factor to it, be it a factor of 10, given the leverage in the system, right? So at the end of the day, the net effect could be something like $10 billion, $20 billion. Frankly, it's anyone's guess. No one in this room, including you or anyone in Hartford, probably has a clue what it is. And with that lurking, we are bringing up all sorts of new taxes, tolls, which will be wasted, I guarantee you that, without thinking about this big macro effect first, frankly. I did Google it, and apparently the state of Connecticut did do a very quick and dirty in 2018. It came up with $14 billion as of 2015, what we as Connecticut residents take as SALT deductions. And I'm just talking about real estate now. Forget about all the other aspects. So my point being, please take that into consideration as we are going headlong into raising taxes and tolls and fees and whatever else we're doing again. Every single new tax or fee or cost that we create, it's the same concept. It's just another incremental reduction in economic activity within the state of Connecticut. So you call it revenue, I call it cost to fund other costs. Mind you, Connecticut is also a very small state. And to me, it seems like it's becoming less and less diversified economically as we're doing all these types of things. And we end up relying more and more on the economic health of other states. For example, Wall Street, that's New York. The other aspect is even more macro. I think we all know that the last 10 plus years, financial assets like our real estate, like our stock market, it's been being propped up by the central banks globally, right? We've had zero interest rate policies, negative interest rate policies, record amounts of credit creation or money printing. And despite such monetary stimulus, Connecticut is still in the mess that it is. Imagine if we didn't have that stimulus. That stimulus is not going to be around forever, I don't think. We tried. Our Federal Reserve tried to rein that in. And if you recall, our stock markets kind of collapsed by 15% within 3 weeks. And then the Federal Reserve basically backpedaled, right, propping things up again. My point being, you cannot count on the stock market doubling windfalls, right, in terms of tax collections. One of these days, that's going to go away. And our prospective $6 billion shortfall projected in 2030 could be $10 billion. So we're running out of time. We're pushed up against the clock, both from a macro perspective and within the state of Connecticut. And everyone's already spoken to it. It's really time to make fundamental changes. We keep doing the same things over and over again. And at the end of the day, no one escapes math. Not Republicans, not Democrats. And to a degree, I'm glad that the state of Connecticut can't print its own money, because chances are we'd be hyperinflating by now. Thank you.
Good points. Yeah, thank
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up.
I'll be quick. I only have 60 issues.
Awesome.
No, first, I would, excuse me? I'm Nick Molino, Georgetown Road, Weston. I'd like to thank Will for standing up for us. I did what I could to prevent his election, and but I'm glad to see he's not towing the line with the party on this, and keep it up.
Thank you.
Although it gets me, I get a little feared when I hear things like trying to make Connecticut a more affordable state, and redistribution of income, and also about legislature abrogating its responsibility to some committee. That's a good way of kind of dodging the bullet and blaming it on someone else. But I have a good solution, since that's what we're looking for, and it's been said many times to cut the spending. The last I looked, we had 106 different bureaus, commissions, boards, agencies, departments, all having chairs, co-chairs. I bet we can't figure out what half of them do. It's a waste of money. And rather than talking about consolidating schools, which should be at the top of the list, there's plenty of those 106 divisions that I think we can get rid of. And that kind of led me to, I think, this has been debated before, but I think we should try to take the government out of as many services as we could. I would like to see everything privatized, but we could privatize most of it, maybe the DMV and the DCF. And I think the DCF, we mentioned one person is in charge of $30 billion of our money. We had one person that was assigned to the Department of Children and Services who had no experience, was a crony, a friend of the governor's, and 2 kids died. So anyway, and one last thing is, if you heard in Stratford during the last election, 76 people, I think, voted on the wrong ballots. And I started thinking about that, and I said, well, it looks like only 1 out of 76 people knew that they got the wrong ballot, that they didn't know who their representative is, didn't know who they were voting for. So, part of the mess is our fault. And I think we've got to pay more attention and call more people out when we don't like it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Dean Robert. I'm on Georgetown Road. Steve, I want to thank you for your prudence, and you've been a terrific partner. A couple years ago when we did this, again, you call the right decisions, and I fully support you with what you're able to share with us tonight, so thank you. I'm concerned. I have 2 kids in school here, and my oldest one's about to enter her freshman year next year. And frankly speaking, in 4 years, with everything you guys are telling me here, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to afford to stay here. That's scary. It's a reality. My youngest is 5, and I'm sorry to say I don't think I'll be here. What concerns me most is some of the statistics about outbound population here in Connecticut. What I haven't heard from anyone here is the discussion about what happens when 63% of the moves are outbound as of January 7th, 2019. It leaves 37% of Connecticut residents moving inbound here. And so I'm thinking this is only going to get worse because the population is going to decline, maybe not in Fairfield County, but as far as the state is concerned. And that just offsets this more on us. And I think in the end of the day, it's just going to make things even more compounded by the unaffordability of everything we're talking about here being proposed in Hartford. So I'd like to know from the educated folk here, and certainly the politicians mainly, what do you feel about the population census and what's going to happen when things change as dramatically as it looks like is starting to happen and has been happening over the last 5 years with respect to all this spending?
Well, can I offer you some updated numbers? It's actually our rate is holding steady. That means that, yes, there's an outbound growth and there are new people coming in, and it's a kind of a wash right now from the
In
data.
Fairfield County or in the state?
No, in Fairfield County from
Okay.
last year. I think we just got the numbers in 2017, and I can forward those to you. We are very interested in what's going to happen after the 2020 census, because it also tells us what our demographics population is. And I just pulled this out for us tonight, that you know that the total population of Weston is around 10,347. Our under 18 is 31.4%. Our 18 to 24 is 4.9%. 25 to 44% is the 25 to 44 is 14.4%, but that means that our growing rate is 45 to 64 at 37.3%. And when I look back over the last couple of years, I'm seeing this. And that is another reason why the governor's budget is looking at, especially up in the northwest corner of Connecticut, some of these school populations that are dramatically declining in their census, and is that sustainable? I mean, it is a reality, and we are looking at those demographics very carefully, but I'd love to forward you some latest information so we can be on the same page and just look at that.
My thought on that is the majority of the problems are outside of our lovely community here and outside of our lovely
Exactly,
county.
which is why we shouldn't be forced to do anything, and why
Fair
actually
enough.
some of this is penalties. So you could call it carrot, but it is penalties, and we're insisting that this budget hold education truly harmless, and that's what that means. I think we're on the same page.
Just to jump in here, it's not the absolute number of in and out. It's
Right.
who's leaving.
That's true. That's
And
very
so-
true. So we
And
need
so
to look
the
at that.
Progressive Caucus, your co-chair,
That's right.
Josh Elliott, who has a modest knowledge of economics, and I'm being polite, doesn't understand the mobility of people. I've had conversations with him about the types of people that are leaving. And the Progressive Caucus, in your love note, which is a term you used on February 14th, which is an odd way to describe that, is calling for predatory taxing on the supposed wealthy. And what you're going to see, and what has happened, and he is not appreciative of this, is that those who can afford to leave will leave. As an example, when Bridgewater wanted to move to Stamford and was offered $25 million of tax relief, which he was against, and they ultimately chose not to do it. He actually didn't know what Bridgewater did. I did explain to him what they do. So it's not the absolute in and out, it's who's leaving and what they pay in taxes. So if the idea is to increase taxes, people who can will leave, and the people that have been leaving are amongst your highest taxpayers because they have that mobility, and that has to be taken into account.
Right, we're talking about equitable tax policy, progressive based on income over $1 million. That is correct. We are
Right.
looking at that.
Well, further to
Because
Steve's point,
this-
Connecticut
this
is the
bo-
only state in the nation that has yet to recover all the jobs lost
That's
during the
correct,
Great
too.
Recession. So
A
you
lot
can
of
imagine
those are the
impact of
financial sector.
equitable tax
And,
policy.
and we have a regressive estate tax. That
Exactly.
the Progressive Caucus is not in favor of repealing.
That's right. That's
And we're
true.
one of few states that have it. So
The estate tax pays entirely for our probate court system. So if we repeal that, we lose our probate court system, which we have no other way of funding, just FYI. So let's be transparent about where these costs really are embedded and what is serving the services for everybody.
well, one billionaire leaving to go to Florida. And let's not forget, Senator Looney did want to tax Yale's endowment, by the way, a couple of years ago. And Governor Scott, now Senator Scott, actually came to New Haven and offered to move Yale to Florida. You can't think that there's not going to be an impact if you tell someone that I'm going to take part of your income because you make more money than the person next door.
It's not about that, with due respect, Steve. It's really about an equitable, because the more income that you make in this state, the lower a tax rate you pay, so proportionally to what you
Your
are. So
co-chair your co-chair said that we could raise taxes, the income tax rate, which up to equal to New York State. Well, that gives people a different choice then.
Mhm. He's actually, he actually, because of his conversation with you, came up with an interesting, different proposal because of what you suggested that we're going to talk about with the governor.
Well, we don't have to debate it tonight because it's.
Yes, I know, but your comments were well placed, and we have to look at the impact of all of these, including on outbound. Thank you.
Representative Hughes, hi, I'm over here. Just to go back to the constituents' question, I think we obviously have a very high percentage of people who live in the Fairfield area who do not work here. They work across the state border.
Right.
So my question to you is, do you know what your risk level is currently? Because what's going on with the state, those are the people that can have the most mobility tomorrow.
Right.
And I think that's what we need to be presenting up in Hartford, that this is the percentage, this is the amount of income that we're going to lose overnight. So that's my first question. My second question to you is then going back to the gentleman, what level of confidence are you instilling in us that we should stay?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I would love to share this with you in terms of where, especially Westons are, how long the average commute is, how many people drive alone, how many people take public transportation, the occupation for civilian employed population, their time leaving to go to work, availables. We do have in this town 21.7 worked in city or town of residence, and 82% work in the state, which means that that there is, a significant, there is a significant amount that are traveling across the border to the state, and we have to look at where those occupations are and their commuter work ethic and their employment status and geographic mobility. I think that's what you really want, is current residents in the past year, median age, same residents, and we have quite a unique district here that is very important to our community, and the mobility of this community is very important to investing in Weston being such an amazing place to live in and work. Can I share this with you? Because I think that's what you're asking, is some of these information.
Senator Haskell, I think you were
Yeah.
going to say something.
Yeah, I know Senator Wong wants to say something as well, but it is late, so I'll keep it very brief. I just want to respond briefly and say that I think any solution that the state is so desperately in need of has to be multi-generational, and we have to build on our assets. And one of our greatest assets, as you mentioned, perhaps the reason you moved to Weston is because of these great public schools. We'd be Remiss if we didn't talk about that more, given the fact that we're in the library. We've got our superintendent here as well, and thank you, sir, for being here. But we have 40,000 people graduate from Connecticut's public schools every year and earn their high school diploma. We have 23,000 people earn their bachelor's degree in Connecticut. I think we have to do a better job of making it an affordable and appealing state for the next generation of workers, not just because we'd be better off if more folks in their 20s and 30s decided to start their small business, their career, their family in this state, but also because the business community has told us time and time again that what they're lacking in Connecticut, a big reason they're either picking up and leaving, thinking about leaving, have left, is the fact that they can attract, and I'm quoting from GE CEO here, a young, diverse, tech-savvy workforce. So that is a core component, I think, of turning the state around, and that means providing student loan relief. We're one of only a few states in the country that has no program for student loan relief, and that's why we have the third highest student debt in the whole country, an average of $34,000 a student. We're working on that in the Higher Education Committee, but I also mentioned that it has to be multi-generational. We're also one of only 13 states that taxes Social Security payments, and I don't mean to go back to this, but this makes it harder for the seniors in our community who do rely on the Social Security checks month after month in order to get by, in order to put food on the table, in order to fill their tank with gas. So I think that we should repeal that tax because it brings in so little, and it's fundamentally not fair. It's income that has already been taxed, as I said before. Responding briefly to Steve, I really do appreciate your expertise here, and we do need to stop the out-migration. But I also think we have to recognize that, and if it's interesting, if you take a look at this, it's always been the case that the wealth of people leaving Connecticut is greater than the wealth of people coming to Connecticut, and that's because this is a state where people are successful. It's where they start. This is a state, or it has been at least traditionally, a state where they start their small businesses, where they climb the corporate ladder, where they build their families. I don't think it's reasonable for us to sit here and promise that one day it'll be millionaires moving here and lower income folks leaving. Instead, let's provide a ladder of opportunity for those who are moving in, perhaps on the lower income scale, to rise through the ranks and ultimately decide to stay here. I think that's the solution to Connecticut, for Connecticut. That means, in my mind, phasing out the estate tax. It certainly means repealing the tax on Social Security, and it also means making sure that more graduates from our schools decide to stay here and reinvest in the community.
I'm going to be simple. We need to have an incredible sense of urgency. No if, and, or buts about it. Maybe I'm not evoking it enough, but we need to share with the people that we as legislators understand and respect that we're in the ninth inning. And unless we are bold and transformative, and I said that, I wished Governor Lamont provided a budget that created as much uproar as we have in the forced regionalization, in the common property tax, but instead saying, how do we transform government? How do we reduce significant pension costs? How do we shape a direction moving forward that is bold, innovative, and really turns it upside down, so that we can give people like yourselves and so many others a sense of positive optimism. But instead, unfortunately, we are followed up with litanies of bills that says redistribution, picking winners and losers, blaming the woes of me. When was it wrong to be successful? So I will say this, we need as a legislative body, stop being so arrogant to think that we have the solutions and start listening to the people that are at their wits' end in saying, I love this town. I love it for my kids to be able to go to school, come back, and be able to raise their family. But the reality is, at this rate, it's not going to happen. And that's sad. But you are also responsible people. You're going to make these decisions. So I would say again, and if I sound so passionate about it, it is because I'm passionate about it. It's why I love what I do. Plain and simple. We need to get off our high horse in thinking that Hartford knows all the answers, and we need to be instilled with a sense of urgency that we don't have enough money to address all the things that we have built up and made promises to people, and we need to start prioritizing where we're going to spend the money. If that means everybody steps up to the table, from labor to managerial employees to our structure of government, let it be so. But the fact right now, we're not doing anything other than saying we need more revenue. Let's put on tolls. Let's do what's really nice for everybody and increase the minimum wage. Let's do what is absolutely fabulous and important of having paid family medical leave. Those are important aspects of creating better quality of life. But are we looking at doing that at the cost of kind of shortening the trail for people to leave the state? We can't be so arrogant to think that we're the only game. It wasn't like this 30, 40 years ago. There are sections of Florida that's Fairfield County South. We can't be arrogant to think the numbers equal out. Because as we have been shown by our tax revenues, by our real estate values, that we're falling behind. So let's get going. Let's have that sense of urgency. Let's respect what we do to represent the people that elected us, not the hierarchy and the overwhelming view of saying, I know what's right for everybody. How about just fixing what's right for the people you represent?
Let's close it out with Mark.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Tony, for that. Margaret Wurtenberg, Wilson Road. I am so grateful that our three boards are here to think of this. This gives me great confidence in the town of Weston, and I'm so grateful that you did this. And as far as our state legislators are concerned, Tony, I think you're saying the right things. And as far as our other representatives and our senator, I don't think you've quite gotten it yet. I think I spoke with you previously. I'm from Weston. The people in this room are from Weston. We want to know what you are going to do for the people of Weston. And I know it's difficult, but you have to remember who elected you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. So again, I'd like to thank Senator Wong Haskell, Representative Hughes for coming down. This was not the easiest thing to organize, but getting three boards together and all our reps, I think, was a very productive thing. I think it was a very intellectual discussion. I hope you have some stuff to bring back up to Hartford. I don't think we differ that much from the rest of Fairfield, so there's a pretty good microcosm of basically a huge section of the tax base of the state. So, just let them know what we're thinking, stand up for us, and please fight your best. Thank you. And thank you especially to the townsfolk who came out and sat through multiple hours of this and contributed amazing commentary. You should be proud of our town. We didn't begin, so we can't adjourn.